I'm Angus Wallace, and this podcast is brought to you by the generous support from listeners. Without your encouragement, I might have given up a while ago. I produce this show twice a month. I enjoy doing it, and hopefully you enjoy listening. And if not all topics are to your fancy, hopefully some are of interest. Here is where you come in. I produce this podcast for free and will continue to do so, but I could always use your help. A small recurring donation via PayPal or Patreon is greatly valued. But I know not everyone wants to stretch that far. Fair enough. If you're interested in one of the books a guest has written and thinking of buying it, why not purchase it via the website www.podcast.com. The orders are fulfilled by Amazon. So it's not me just posting books. By purchasing via my store, Amazon will give me a small profit share of the book. It's another way of helping me create the podcast, and I thank you for that support. In this episode, we're looking at a topic we touched upon way back in episode 6 when we looked at the OSS. We're looking this time out at the OSS Station Chief in Bern, Switzerland, Alan Dulles, and his connections with the German resistance during the war. Dulles, incredibly, was approached by a number of Germans unhappy with the Nazi regime who fed him information from 1943 onwards. I'm joined by Scott Miller. Scott's book, Agent 110, looks at Dulles' operation in Switzerland and pieces together his connections with the German resistance. Thanks for joining me. I don't think it's unfair to the rest of the OSS operation to say the most successful and glamorous posting during the war was that of Dulles in Switzerland. Shall we start with who was Dulles? What was his background?
He was kind of a very interesting choice to become a spy. He came from an important American family. Two of his relatives had been Secretary of State. His particular family, they didn't have a lot of money. His father was a Presbyterian minister, but he'd sort of grown up around important people. His grandfather had helped set up kind of a family compound at Henderson Harbor in upstate New York, and they would spend summers there. And his grandfather would bring important figures from international relations up to the area, and the family would go camping and fishing with all sorts of important people. Dulles, when he was a kid, he went and stayed with his grandfather in Washington and met a lot of diplomats and kind of, I think, got a little bit of a bug for it when he was just a young kid. He wasn't the student that his brother, John Foster Dulles, was. His brother later became Secretary of State. He liked the ladies, always did, which caused problems in his marital relationship later on. He went to Princeton, traveled the world, and then came back and entered the State Department, did a couple of postings, and then just to make money, he left the State Department and became a lawyer, got a law degree, and joined his brother's law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell. And once again, sort of traveled the world. He did work for the U.S. government in arms negotiations and whatnot, and became fairly well known around New York. He tried to run for Congress at one point, I think in the very early 1940s or late 1930s, and kind of established himself as a moderate Republican. Got to know along the way the future head of the OSS, William Donovan, who asked him to go to Switzerland shortly after the U.S. entered the war.
What do you think Donovan saw in him? I keep thinking to myself, and this will sort of, when we get further on, it's all very George Smiley and Le Carre, but the start of this is so much more, amateur. It's almost like Marx Brothers, because Donovan isn't from an espionage background. I wondered why he picked what he saw in Dulles to choose him for one of the prime posts of the war.
Well, they both had worked on Wall Street together, and that's where they originally got to know each other. Dulles was also very active in sort of the international relations community. He was very active at the Council on Foreign Affairs in New York and wrote some articles. Together with another fellow, he co-authored a book about American preparedness for the war, or lack of preparedness. There was also sort of just a real sense that early on, when the OSS was just getting formed, that it really was sort of a club. They did pull in a lot of Ivy League types and people who knew each other. And as you said, it was sort of amateur hour. The OSS, they had a Mo Berg, who was a baseball player but spoke a lot of languages. Julia Child, the famous chef, joined as an analyst. And it was just sort of all comers. Dulles was seen as somebody who was fairly bright, and he had been in the State Department, so he was familiar with Europe. He had, in fact, served a posting with the State Department in Bern, so he was familiar with Switzerland. He spoke a little German, although even late in the war, when he'd been in Switzerland for a long time, everybody laughed at his terrible accent, and he still needed help. He'd meet, important German agents in 1944, and he still would have to have somebody help translate. So he wasn't a gifted linguist, but he was familiar with what was happening overseas. And the Americans had sent somebody to Switzerland ahead of them to try and gather intelligence, and it hadn't been entirely successful. There was seen to be a real crowd in Switzerland of business people and important contacts, and they needed somebody who was used to traveling in those sorts of circles, which Dulles certainly had a lot of experience in, and that's why they picked him up and sent him over there.
His trip to Switzerland itself is somewhat daring-do. I wonder if you could tell us about that.
Well, apparently there were all sorts of problems once he decided to go to Switzerland, and I think Donovan was glad to get rid of him. I don't know that Donovan and Dulles got along particularly well. Donovan came from sort of a bootstrapping Catholic family, and he pulled himself up, and Dulles came from a waspy American background, and he expected great things. And there was one famous incident before Dulles left where he had a meeting with Donovan in a New York hotel. He went to Donovan's room, the door was open, and he saw secret papers spread out all over the bed and the floor. Dulles, being a little bit of a prankster, scooped him up, all these private, important documents, and took him down to the lobby, and then phoned Donovan and said, by the way, those documents, I had a question about one of them. and of course, Donovan couldn't find them, and a moment of panic ensued before Dulles told him what he did. And apparently, Donovan wasn't too thrilled about that. So he was probably happy to get Dulles out of his hair. The trip itself, he was under a bit of time pressure. He had some problems getting his paperwork together. And when they finally did, they learned that the American army was going to invade North Africa, where there happened to be French troops stationed, and France being sort of a puppet state at that point of the Germans. And so it was very likely that French and American troops were going to be fighting. Up till that point, Vichy France, the French government, had some diplomatic relations with the U.S. And so Dulles needed to get to Switzerland because he had to pass through France to get there. He needed to get there before this attack took place. So he took one of these flying boats, airplanes from LaGuardia Airport's Marine Air Terminal. He went to the Bahamas, and they landed in the Azores, which was a refueling stop on the way. And there was very bad weather, and so he got stuck there for a couple of days. And so you can imagine Dulles just nervously pacing, looking at the skies and the sea, wondering, when are we going to get out of here? Because this attack is going to happen, and I won't be able to get to Switzerland. They finally left, and he went to Portugal and finally to Spain. Made his way up the coast, and he just got to the border with France. And when he learned that the attack had taken place, that French and American troops were fighting in North Africa, and he describes himself, walking around the train station, agonizing about whether to proceed to get on the train and go into France, where, God knows what might happen to him. He decided in the end to do it. The train took all night to get across France, and he would get out at each stop and look around the platform to see if anybody was getting on, any security officials. He finally got to the border between France and Switzerland and got off the train. At this point, Switzerland is virtually in sight. So he's making his way down the platform, and he notices that all of the passengers have to go through a little bit of a security screening, and he notices that there's a German guy there. And Dulles correctly decided that was a Gestapo agent. He thought about making a run for it and trying to run out of the station and sneak across the border on foot, but he decided that wouldn't work. So he finally got to the front of the line, and his passport was an American diplomatic passport. It had his real name, but the purpose of his trip was his cover. He was going as the special assistant to the head of the American mission in Bern. And of course, there was nothing about him being a spy in his documents. So the German got a hold of his passport and said, I'm sorry, we're going to have to take you aside and make some phone calls. Dulles was really nervous. He took out his wallet that had a large amount of French money in it and kind of flashed that around as a potential bribe to anybody that would let him pass. That didn't work. And so he stood there agonizing on the train platform until, and this is one of the things I love about history, just the weird things that happen. It happened to be late morning, and while he was waiting, the noon hour struck. And the Gestapo agent was very punctual, decided it was time for his lunch, so he gave Dulles's passports and documents to a French border guard and took off for his lunch. The French official came over to Dulles and said in French something to the effect of, you see, we're not all collaborators, and gave him his passport back, and Dulles was allowed into Switzerland. And what he claimed, Dulles claimed that he was the last American to get into Switzerland before the borders were sealed, which is, it's hard to dispute that. I think he really just got in by the skin of his teeth.
There can't have been many following him, certainly. He was, if he wasn't the last, he must have been almost the last. Mm-hmm. What was he tasked to do in Switzerland? What were they expecting for him to do there?
There's kind of two parts to your question. What was he supposed to do, and what did he actually do? He was supposed to just be pretty much a routine spy. He was supposed to gather intelligence that would be helpful for the Allied war effort, for the military. He was supposed to gather information about conditions, living conditions inside Germany, and work with resistance movements a little bit, because where Switzerland was located, it was a very effective place to make contact with the French resistance or the Italian resistance. So nobody really thought of the German resistance very much. And so that was his initial job. As we talked about, Dulles wasn't really trained as a spy. He didn't like taking orders. And it wasn't long before he kind of redefined his job description and started to do all sorts of other things.
Yeah. Presumably, you couldn't really relieve him because no one would be able to come in and take his job with the borders sealed.
Well, exactly. he had tremendous freedom. I mean, it didn't go well for him to start with. He set up his headquarters at this villa in the old part of Bern on the Herrengasse. He had some contacts with him from when he had been in the State Department and from his legal career. And he had some contacts that the OSS had gave him. But he really needed to get out and meet more people. His primary technique to begin with was to just flash a lot of money around. He always bragged about how much money he had access to. And that didn't really sit very well with the Brits. Philosophically, they thought that intelligence that was purchased really couldn't really be relied upon. And plus, it was just sort of obnoxious. Here comes this Yank. One of the British agents in Switzerland said something like, yeah, we all know Dulles. He's got a sign on the door that says information purchased here. He had another sort of guiding philosophy of that he was willing to speak to anybody about anything. When he was in the State Department, he had been in Switzerland briefly, and he was in the American embassy one Sunday afternoon. This is probably like 1917. And he got a call from somebody, a Russian, who wanted to meet him. And Dulles had a tennis date with an attractive young lady that afternoon, and quickly made up his mind that the girl was more interesting than some Russian. He later found out that the guy who wanted to meet with him was none other than Vladimir Lenin. Dulles talked about that experience throughout his career and at the OSS and later in the CIA as a learning experience. So you just never know. You really should talk to everybody. It was a bit difficult for him being new in town, and there were a lot of sort of professional information peddlers who they'd learn some fact in the morning or invent some fact, and then they would go around to various embassies and the spies they knew and try to sell it throughout the day. And Dulles was probably a little bit more gullible than he should have, and he passed along some pretty bad information in retrospect. Of course, hindsight's 20/20. But there was one point where he got a memo from Washington that said, by the way, the War Department really doesn't believe a lot of what you're saying. You might want to check your sources a little more thoroughly. So it was a little bit of a rocky start.
Yeah, he did probably get 2-3 remarkable successes, certainly 2 remarkable successes walked through his door, and he believed them where others would not necessarily Well, I think the Brits had already turned them down, hadn't they? I was thinking of Fritz Kolbe and Hans Gazebos. How did they know to go to him? It's such a strange thing. If I was in London, I would not know where to go to find if I was disgruntled civilian, I would not know where to go to find a spy to tell.
And it kind of defeats the purpose. If you're a spy, but everybody knows where you live, how much of a spy can you be?
Well, that's another thing. They were aware of him, weren't they? They're in Switzerland. A French paper outed him.
There was a Swiss newspaper, French language Swiss newspaper, that sort of outed him. They found out that Dulles was in Switzerland. They wrote an article about him because Dulles was well known in certain circles for his work before the war and sort of some of the disarmament, naval disarmament talks. So he was known a little bit, and so this Swiss newspaper wrote, "Oh, by the way, Alan Dulles is here in Switzerland." And they said he's here as a special emissary of President Roosevelt. And it's not clear where they came up with that angle. And Dulles when he first read that article, he was aghast. He said, I thought my career as a spy was over. And at first he kind of tried to deny it, but then he realized that it actually presented him with a secondary cover, which might actually be widely believed. His outward cover was that he was there as a diplomat, but then the word spread that he was this emissary of Roosevelt. And in fact, the Germans believed that. When the Germans found out he was there, they did a study on him, and a paper was done up on Dulles where they said that's what he's here working for Roosevelt and to gather information about the German economy. So the Germans kind of missed what he was up to. So that sort of helped. And of course, Bern was an absolute nest of spies during World War II. There was spies from every country you can think of, and in large numbers, most of them under some sort of diplomatic cover like Dulles. So it probably didn't take very long for people to figure out he was up to some sort of espionage work. Even late in the war, the fact that he was actually working for the OSS was not widely known.
Yet, let's look at Colby. He walks through his door. He works for the German Foreign Office. Why did he seek out Dulles? Why did he become a turncoat?
Kolbe had a friend in Switzerland who was kind of scouting people for him to meet with. Kolbe, as you said, was kind of a low-level diplomat or a clerk, really, in the foreign ministry in Berlin. He was very much opposed to the Nazis. Incredibly, he never joined the Nazi party. He also didn't like the Bolsheviks. So he kind of took it upon himself to gather secret materials when he could. He had a rather unique position in the foreign ministry where documents from the German military would pass through his desk on the way to more senior people. And so Kolbe started coming in on Sundays and writing summaries of these secret documents from the German army and the German navy. And as you said, he needed somebody to give them to. His friend originally approached the Brits in Switzerland, and the British turned him down. They had earlier in the war lost a couple of agents when a couple of MI6 agents, under a similar explanation, somebody had come forward and said, "Hi, I'm German, but I want to work with you guys. Come meet me in this city by the Dutch border." And these two agents were kidnapped, and they were imprisoned in Germany throughout the war. And so the Brits were very leery of falling into that trap again. I guess you scratch the Brits off your list, then who's next up? The Americans. They're kind of new to the game, and God knows if they can be trusted or, what they're going to be like, but their plan B. And so Kolbe's friend came and tracked Dulles down in Bern, and that's where they had their first meeting.
What did you say? He's low level, but there weren't that many steps up the hierarchy to get to Hitler from Kolbe. So he was relatively well connected. What information did he have to offer?
Kolbe's boss was quite important and kind of acted as a conduit between the branches of the German military and the foreign ministry. So there were loads of documents coming in from the Army and the Navy and the Air Force through the foreign ministry, just to kind of let the foreign ministry know what they were up to. And so there were all sorts of secrets, secret plans, U-boats, where the U-boat movements, codes passed across his desk. So he was privy to some secret codes, even to some agents who were working overseas. In Ireland was a famous one, and he was able to learn about that. And he also just traveled to important places with his boss. One of the first documents that he gave to Dulles was a map of Hitler's headquarters on the Eastern Front, the Wolf's Lair. And it had everything. It showed the complete layout, where Hitler's bunker were, where the conference rooms were, where the movie house was, where the railroad tracks were. And it was kind of one of the joys of my research. That map still exists in the American National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and it looks brand new. I kind of had to look at it and think, did somebody just put this in here? And it's all written out in English, but Dulles describes in detail about getting that map. So he just was a conduit, really, between the German services and the foreign ministry.
How could he get the information out? It's brought to him. It's one thing having the information in Switzerland, but it's getting it back to the US in a timely manner to be acted upon.
That was always a problem. And kind of early in the war, the Americans, they would give some material to, some secret material to diplomats from neutral countries who could enter and leave Switzerland. But you never really knew if it was going to reach its final destination, and sometimes it went missing, and you couldn't entirely trust the people you were giving these documents to. So they would use just commercial telegraph lines and even telephone lines. And the Swiss helped Dulles to some extent, and he sent things by code, which he employed a very simple code, which, as it would turn out, was easily broken. And coding was always a problem. It was very time consuming. And so Dulles was able to make use of American pilots who had crashed or crash landed in Switzerland and were unable to leave. They were basically imprisoned in Switzerland because it was a neutral country, but there was no way for them to leave. But the Swiss kind of secretly allowed Dulles to use these pilots. But a lot of it went out by commercial telegraph, and it was a constant worry because the Swiss could easily listen to the telegraph. They could listen into what was being sent over their telegraph system. And some of the Swiss were pro-American and pro-British, and some were pro-German. It was always a great risk to see who was listening and, what sort of material would be intercepted. And there were a couple of humdingers where the Germans got a hold of their correspondence and were able to crack the codes and read their mail.
It did amuse me. You write about, Colby literally copying hundreds of documents. I had visions of Dulles sitting at his desk just wondering how he was going to get all the information out with heaps of paperwork around him.
The other solution that he arrived on later that was pretty interesting was Kolbe later on, Dulles gave him a camera so he didn't have to write things out by hand. And it was on microfilm, and he was able to get that to Dulles. And Dulles devised kind of this lengthy system to get the film out of Switzerland. They approached a French railroad engineer, a guy who worked on a train, convinced him to build a secret compartment in his locomotive that he could store film in. It had a little trap door that the conductor could use. If he felt like the train was being searched, he could hit this little trap door, and all the film would fall in the boiler of the locomotive and instantly be incinerated so he could get rid of the evidence. So they devised this whole system where they would take material to Geneva and put it on this train, and the train would take it to Lyon, where it would make its way by bicycle and car down to the Mediterranean and taken by boat to another place where it could be flown out. It was flown to London initially and then on to Washington. But they did that when they had larger amounts of material to transport. And you can imagine that probably took some time to go through all those steps. And, anything that's that complicated can lead to problems. And you get the more people who are involved, the more people who might be sympathetic to the Germans or just be purchased. So it was always a risky operation.
Well, you wonder as well in the time, I know the war was on for 5 years, but it's a fast-moving situation, and you would wonder by the time you've got the information all the way back to the US, is it then out of date to do anything other than confirm what you already knew?
Well, a big part of the problem was just convincing, in the case of Kolbe, to convince his colleagues back in Washington to believe anything. For months, Kolbe was, risking his neck, bringing all this material to Dulles, and Dulles wasn't really sure that Kolbe was on the up and up. Everybody kind of thought this is just too good to be true, that this guy just walks in off the street and he's giving us hundreds of pages of secret documents. That just doesn't happen. But it turned out that it was legit, but Washington didn't believe him for the longest time, and they conducted studies to match the material that Dulles was giving them from Kolbe against what they already knew. They contacted the Brits, who were very suspicious, to say the least, and there was probably some rivalry going on. So it took just a long time before the Americans would even believe the information. And then it was a constant frustration for Kolbe, who was undertaking all these risks, as I said. And even when the Americans started to believe him, they didn't act on it quite a bit. Kolbe would give them really detailed reports about bombing targets. This such and such a factory is making ball bearings, or, your last bombing raid didn't hit this place. You should go back and get it. And so he would get this stuff to Dulles, and Dulles would send it to the U.S., and it didn't seem like the Americans acted on it that often. I think there was just always a lingering suspicion that we just have this one source. How much can we really trust him? Are we really going to organize a whole bombing raid based on this one guy? They finally came around to it in the end, but it took a long, long time.
If he'd just got Kolbe as his main source, that would be one thing. It would still be a huge success. But he gets two, because there's Hans-Bern Gazebos sort of walks through his door as well, and he's another coup really, considering he was German Abwehr. How did he come to Dulles?
I think he was another one. The Brits knew about Gazebos, who was in Switzerland under diplomatic cover, but everybody knew that he worked for the Abwehr, which was the intelligence arm of the German military. I think he just approached Dulles. I think he was probably one of these people who saw, Dulles in the newspaper as being this guy with contacts with Roosevelt. And that's what attracted Gazebos to Dulles in the first place. The British were just much more ensconced in Switzerland. I mean, that needs to be said just by way of background. And so the Americans really kind of looked to the British quite a bit early on for guidance on things. And the British had warned Dulles not to get near Gazebos. Gazebos had, through the German security and police forces, he'd been in the Gestapo. Now he was in the Abwehr, and he was not a very likable figure. He was 6'4", very muscular build, very arrogant, wasn't a particularly likable figure. He was one of the first people who showed up at Dulles's office when Dulles first got there. Dulles did what research he could about him, and wasn't really sure, but figured that it was worth a shot. And so they had a couple of meetings, and Gazebos was the first one that kind of let Dulles know that the German resistance and underground was out there and really wanted American support. But he went a long way towards winning Dulles over. This was just a few months after Dulles arrived. They had a meeting. I think it maybe was their second meeting. They were sitting there chatting, and Gazebos reached into his pocket and pulled out a little black book. He promptly read to Dulles almost verbatim a secret document that the Americans had sent out of Switzerland to the U.S. And there was no way that anybody should have seen that, let alone the Germans. And it had some sensitive information about it. The Americans had said that the Italian foreign minister, who was also Mussolini's son-in-law, had some suspicions about fascism and might be somebody who the Allies could work with. And the Germans had got a hold of that and given it to Hitler, who gave it to Mussolini, and Mussolini promptly demoted his son-in-law from being foreign minister and sent him off to the Vatican, some low-level diplomatic job at the Vatican. So that was kind of a major fail for the Americans early on. But for Dulles, it was, maybe this guy Gazebos is on the level, because if you're breaking a code, you don't want to reveal that if you don't have to. It was really valuable for the Americans, because then they could, of course, send bogus information with the code that they knew was broken and feed the Germans bad information. And then, of course, they stopped using it for the sensitive information they wanted to send. But Dulles wrote that was a real sort of landmark in their relationship and helped give him a lot of confidence in Gazebos.
Well, he's a curious character because he's very well connected with, I mean, it gets called the German resistance. I always kind of get a bit funny about calling it the German resistance because it seems to be resistance seems to imply one thing. I have visions of a bit more resistance than necessary, potentially in my mind, what they did, which seems to be a lot of talking and not a lot of happening.
Fair point.
With it. But he's well connected with it, wasn't he?
It was his job in the Abwehr that really made him well connected. And the Abwehr was a weird place. Wilhelm Canaris, who was the head of the Abwehr, one of the most senior spies in all of Germany, didn't like Hitler. Originally, he had seen some wisdom what Hitler was doing, as a lot of Germans did in the 1930s when Hitler first came around, and Hitler was going to right the wrong of the Versailles Treaty, and he won some people over. Canaris was a bit of a Renaissance man. He was well-traveled. He spoke foreign languages and just wasn't somebody who was going to easily fall into the Nazi Brotherhood. And so he carved out a number of senior positions within the Abwehr for people who really wanted to fight the Nazis. Very senior jobs in the Abwehr. And that's how Gazebos ended up in the Abwehr and was sent to Switzerland for a couple of reasons, one of which was to make contacts with the Allies. So Gazebos was well connected with Canaris. Gazebos knew a lot of, from the early days, the people who were opposed to Hitler, military officers, some politicians. So you're absolutely right. He was very well connected from an early point in the war.
And he was actually at one point investigated himself by the Gestapo, wasn't he? And somehow got away with it.
Yeah. Well, I think one of his friends called him an eternal plotter. And it certainly was. He was in the Gestapo early in the 30s, in the early days of the Gestapo. And he tried to, he was very ambitious. He was a lawyer by training, and not that necessarily made him ambitious, but he had high hopes for himself. He decided that he was going to spread a rumor that the head of the Gestapo was a communist. I don't know if he had any reason to think that or if it was just pure calculation. So he let that rumor get out there. It turned out not to be true. And so he got pushed out of the Gestapo, and really only friends elsewhere in the German government protected him. They gave him jobs, and he actually became an important figure just in the security of the Berlin Olympic Games. But he always talked about how dangerous it was. And he once said that it was so bad that if you wanted to go to the bathroom, that it was advisable to tell your colleagues that's where you were going, so that they would be able to find you if you didn't turn up right away.
And he, if I said directly involved with Valkyrie, the failed assassination, or one of the failed assassination attempts, he was part of the group. Is probably a better way of. How involved was he? He
wasn't intimately involved in the planning. He knew that the planning was going on because he was down in Switzerland all this time. And a lot of the people that he had worked with early in the war had since been captured and discovered by the Gestapo. And really, he was on pretty thin ice by then anyway. His situation was very precarious. And there kind of had been this sort of Jimmy come lately to the German underground, Klaus von Stauffenberg. He's probably the most famous of all the members of the German underground, and of course was portrayed by Tom Cruise in the movie Valkyrie. And having Tom Cruise portray him wasn't entirely a bad idea, because Stauffenberg really did look like a movie star. He was, also an incredible Renaissance man. He loved poetry and writing and shooting, and, was a terrific figure. And it was Stauffenberg who really sort of picked up what by then was a bit of a shambles of the German underground and re-energized them to undertake the attack, the Valkyrie attack on July 20th, 1944. So Gazebos really didn't get along with Stauffenberg. They didn't know each other very well, but Stauffenberg was kind of a newbie, and he was really shaking up the underground. And a lot of Gazebos' friends didn't like what Stauffenberg was trying to do. He was taking everything over, and He had plans for a new German government that didn't include them, even though they had seen themselves assuming senior roles in whatever government would follow once Hitler was assassinated. Gazebos was prone to disliking him, and Gazebos, we have to keep in mind, it's Gazebos' account because Stauffenberg didn't leave one. He didn't have the opportunity. When they first met, and Gazebos was very put off by Stauffenberg in early July when they first met. It was in the basement of a mutual friend, and Stauffenberg had been seriously injured in military action in North Africa and had an eye patch and was really kind of struggling. And Gazebos thought that he was rude to their hosts and had a lot of crazy ideas and wanted to steer Germany towards communism after the war. And they had a very bitter argument that night that kind of lasted until the wee hours of the morning. As I said, that's Gazebos' account, and God knows how it really transpired. But it's safe to say that those two didn't get along.
If we loop this sort of back into Dulles, how aware was Dulles of Stauffenberg and Valkyrie and certainly that major plot against Hitler?
I think he was quite aware. One of the prime concerns of the German underground was, and this is the reason that they approached Dulles to begin with, was to receive American blessing for whatever government might follow the removal of Hitler. They all remembered how horrible it had been after World War I and how unfairly Germany had been treated. Basically, they didn't want to risk their necks if the U.S. and Britain and France were going to treat Germany just as badly again. And so they wanted a promise that Germany would be well looked after, and maybe even that Germany would be allowed to continue the war against the Soviets. That was a constant theme. We have to protect our eastern borders. They approached Dulles a number of times with various schemes to try and win him over. In 1944, they put forward a proposal where they said, we're working with a number of German generals who promise that they will basically aid an American invasion of Berlin, a paratroop invasion, and we'll help you with a seaborne landing in the area. But all we ask is that you help us after the war. Dulles wanted to help them, but he knew that it would never fly with Roosevelt. Roosevelt had been Undersecretary of the Navy after World War I and had been there for the Paris peace talks. He, too, had seen how bad that peace treaty had been, but he kind of drew a different conclusion. The problem from World War I was that Germany had never been completely defeated on the battlefield. And so in World War II, the Allies had to totally destroy Germany. There couldn't be any negotiating with them. And that was a constant message to Dulles. And Dulles pleaded with Roosevelt to relax on that if you could just give the underground a little bit of support, it would embolden them and it would help them recruit members. But it was something that Roosevelt just could never be brought around on. As July 20th approached, Dulles sent numerous messages to Washington saying something is about to happen. Gazebos, who had been in Switzerland, left about a week before July 20. He wanted to be part of the action, and I think maybe also to assume an attractive job in the new government. So Dulles knew that it was coming, and when he did receive a phone call that the attack had happened, he didn't know, what had happened, but he learned there had been an attack. It certainly was no surprise for him.
At any point, was he actually able to give any direct aid to any of these resistance groups in Germany, or was it just never asked for?
That is an excellent question, and it was one that I spent a lot of time ruminating over. There is some evidence, there are some German sources that have indicated that maybe with a wink and a nudge, Dulles said, provided some encouragement. It probably, if it did come, it was very vague about what the Americans would do. The German underground certainly knew they had a friend in Dulles who would do whatever he could. Interestingly, after July 20, the State Department warned Dulles to not engage in any sort of talks like that again, which makes you wonder if the State Department had heard something. Dulles himself repeatedly said that he had lived up to Roosevelt's instructions to the letter. If I had to guess, I would say that Dulles probably was as I said, with a wink, you guys do what you can do and I'll do what I can do. And, maybe we can make it work out.
I wondered if rather he was more of a receiver and they sort of almost didn't ask for it. But as you say, it's quite hard to read between the lines. Because there's also, which you very well summed up, it's not that they wanted to necessarily stop the war, the resistance. They just wanted to stop it against the West. Which again shows a strange sort of political ambiguity on their part.
Partly they could have been saying that for their audience because it was well known in the German report that the German intelligence did about Dulles when he first arrived, even that early, in early 1942, they had, or early 1943 rather, it was well known that Dulles didn't like the Soviets. And so they could have been playing to their audience of, hey, let's all team up against those bad Reds. Roosevelt had the exact opposite view. Roosevelt was determined to forge a good relationship with Stalin and the Soviet Union. And remember, there was planning underway at this time for the United Nations. And, I think Roosevelt, dearly hoped that maybe the U.S. and the Soviet Union could work closely together after the war to prevent yet another world war. That maybe their interests would align. And Roosevelt had tremendous confidence in the force of his own personality. And he had met Stalin, of course, at some of the wartime summit meetings and, really played up to him. And there was on one occasion, he really threw Churchill under the bus when the three of them were meeting and, was joking around with Stalin. And Roosevelt just was not going to do anything that might be seen to jeopardize that, his hopes of this grand friendship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
What I also find amazing, as the war is drawing to a close, Stauffenberg's bombs being a failure, there's a huge crackdown in Germany on almost anybody who could be resistance to the regime. Both men get out. And did Dulles aid both of them, or I didn't make a note whether he had both of them or not, but they do both get out, don't they?
Yes. Kolbe, for a guy who didn't have a high level of education and certainly no training in espionage, that guy he was a miracle worker because he did a lot. And the Germans never wised up to him. He was stealing stuff out from under their noses. They said up to 2,000 documents that he stole from the foreign ministry that he supplied to the Americans. He was actually quite lucky. He was kind of operating by himself, and he knew some people who knew the Valkyrie plotters, and they kind of invited him on a couple of occasions to join them and go to their meetings. And for various reasons, he chose not to. And it's a good thing. It probably saved his life because if he had gone to these meetings, his name would have been attached to theirs and he probably would have been rounded up. So the fact that he was just kind of working on his own was his best security. Gazebos, his story is remarkable. After the crackdown, after the failed Valkyrie attack, he went into hiding. He kind of traveled around the Berlin area for a couple of days, wasn't able to find anybody who could shelter him until he happened upon a lady friend of his, is the way it's described, moved into this house, which apparently was very close to Gestapo headquarters. It's not entirely clear to me whether the Gestapo or the Germans, to what extent they knew he was in Germany. He kind of got lost in the shuffle, so people weren't looking for him with great determination. But anyway, he was stuck in this house. He was able to get words eventually to Dulles that he was alive for a long time. Nobody knew what happened to him. It was just dead air on the Gazebos front. He was able to get word out, and Dulles hit upon the idea of smuggling him out as a Gestapo agent. And apparently this was a scheme that the OSS had used before with Germans. And so they had access to some papers, some Gestapo papers, which they made copies of. But there was one thing that was very difficult for them. Gestapo agents have a little metal, it's about the size of a belt buckle, a little sort of metal medallion, and it has their number on the back. The OSS, who basically turned a lot of this over to the English to help them with, they weren't able to figure out the metallic compound of this metal medallion, and it has their number on the back. The OSS, who basically turned a lot of this over to the English to help them with, they weren't able to figure out the metallic compound of this metallic of this, buckle size button. And of course, they had no idea what number to put. So they just kind of guessed at a number, presumably with the correct number of digits, if nothing else. It took them a long time to do all that. And then they were taking it to Switzerland. They discovered there was an error. And so they sent it back to England, and the courier got stopped outside Paris by a military policeman of some sort who found this guy with all these Gestapo papers. And they threw the courier in jail, thinking he was some kind of Nazi. So that slowed everything down. They finally got all the paperwork together. They were able to, with the help of a Swiss network, they were able to get it to Gazebos, who had to take a train from Berlin to Switzerland. And Gazebos at this point must have looked a fright. He was wearing the same suit, and this is January already, in that, January of 1945, and that attack took place in the summer of 1944. He had been cutting his hair with some nail clippers, but with these papers, he went to the train station in Berlin, forced his way onto a train. Very cleverly, he got a couple of children who he'd never seen before to sit on his lap, one on either knee, so that anybody who might recognize him would be, he's basically hiding behind these kids until he got out of Berlin. He finally got to the border with Switzerland. In the wee hours of the morning, he was wearing some fur-lined, snow boots, a hat that he'd stolen from somebody on the train, and these fake documents, and this rumpled suit. He figured that the border guards would probably think, this guy's got to be legit. Nobody would look like this who was really trying to sneak across. And he was able to get across the border and safely made it into Switzerland.
I find it incredible that his two top agents, considering it's almost the amateurness of the operation, both managed to survive the war. What happened to them after the war? Did they ever get... I got the feeling that they would both have quite liked jobs in the post-war administration. What happened to them after the war?
Things really didn't go particularly well for either one of them. Gazebos, as you say, I think he was hoping for a good job in the occupation government, but the Americans had a very strict, to the point of being unreasonable, anti-Nazi policy after the war for jobs in the occupation government. So, Dulles fought it bitterly. Dulles, really wanted to get Germany back on its feet. And he said, you can't run the train system in Germany without Nazi help, or, people who had formerly been in the Nazi party. But because Gazebos had been in the Gestapo, even though he'd provided Dulles with all this help, it really kind of prevented him from receiving a good job. He was of tremendous help in the Nuremberg war crimes trials, and he went and testified against Hermann Göring, who had been his boss in the early days of the Gestapo. As we know, Göring was able to smuggle a poison tablet into his cell with some help and killed himself before he was hanged. After that, Gazebos, he lived in Switzerland. He wrote a couple of books, but really didn't achieve a lot of his grand ambitions. Kolbe, the little guy from the foreign ministry, he too was desperate to get a job in the new German foreign ministry, and once again didn't really work out. He worked with Dulles a little bit. He was involved in a horrible traffic accident right after the war when he was riding in an American Jeep. It required a lot of hospitalization. Those could have been many things, and there were many negative qualities have been ascribed to Dulles, but lack of gratitude wasn't one of them. And he really looked after Kolbe and got him a car, which was almost unthinkable after the war, and made sure that he got a lot of rations. And the OSS and the American intelligence services helped Kolbe come to the U.S. after the war and set him up in business as an asbestos salesman. Kolbe wasn't much of a businessman at all. His business only lasted a few months, and he didn't like the commercial aspects of the United States and returned to Germany and just kind of performed various sales type jobs there. And he eventually, he died in Switzerland, and very sadly, I think just like a dozen people attended his funeral. I think more recently, just in the last few years, the German Foreign Ministry has recognized his contribution to fighting the Nazis. And I think they've named like a conference room after him at the Foreign Ministry in Berlin.
Dulles obviously went on after the war, initially posted to Berlin, but that can't have been long because they wound the OSS up almost as soon as the war was over. Mm-hmm. and obviously went on to be CIA chief for, it was quite a long time actually, he was CIA chief. I was looking at the dates the other day. I was quite surprised. So obviously his background in Switzerland did him well. In the grand scheme of things, you know, looking 70 years later, you know, how much use was Dulles and his agents in Switzerland?
Well, that was always, you know, to the contributions of the OSS have always been sort of controversial. There were some major successes and some failures, and the OSS in general, the other branches of the military were always scheming against it, and there was a lot of rivalry, sort of bad blood. As far as Dulles, I think he definitely provided Washington with some very valuable intelligence about V-2 rockets. The Kolbe, when they finally did recognize Kolbe's value, that was seen as a huge success for him, you know, for Dulles. Dulles was also involved in this, it's called Operation Sunrise, and he was able to, in a very sort of protracted and painful manner, but he was able to achieve the surrender of all the German forces in Italy. Unfortunately, it was just about 5 days before the Germans surrendered anyway, so probably some marginal value there. Although, you know, in Italy, the fact that the Germans were negotiating with him probably saved Italian artifacts from being destroyed. Hitler had ordered, Italian artwork to be destroyed and factories to be destroyed, but the people that Dulles was negotiating with weren't of a mind to do those sorts of things while they were talking to him. That's a very good question. What was the actual contribution towards winning the war? Probably, you know, Dulles also did a very good job of gathering names of people to participate in the occupation who were pro-American. And so it was good to have that sort of, you know, those sorts of people on the ground and ready to go when the occupation happened. But in terms of winning the war, it's almost like Dulles's work is probably a tale of a missed opportunity. The fact that he couldn't convince Roosevelt to go along with the resistance, the fact that the negotiations, which weren't entirely Americans' fault, but that they dragged on so long in Italy, and that the Americans had taken so long to trust Kolbe, you know, really kind of blunted a lot of the good work that Dulles did while he was in Switzerland.
It's funny you alluded to the FDR's unconditional insistence on unconditional surrender. It hadn't occurred to me sort of until I sort of read the book how, and Churchill was against it, how kind of coming out with that is it framed policy because it's so, well, it's unconditional. No, that's it. There's no bargaining. That's it. So because of that, we go down a rat hole of a whole series of what ifs.
Yeah.
Otherwise, but
and it's always been sort of a mystery as to why Roosevelt was so determined. You know, as you said, he kind of sprung it on Churchill. I think it was January of 1943 when they met in Casablanca. They had talked about unconditional surrender a little bit, but it certainly hadn't been agreed upon them until they were in a press conference, and Roosevelt said, "Oh, by the way, we demand Germany and Japan and Italy's unconditional surrender." And poor Roosevelt was like, "What? You know, I don't think we really are on the same page about that." And Roosevelt got a lot of pushback, you know, from his own Joint Chiefs. Certainly, Secretary of State Hull did not like that. You know, you could argue that it made the Germans fight harder because they would have to fight to the bitter end. They knew that there would be no negotiating, and it made the Americans and the British sound like they were going to be very vengeful in victory. I've seen explanations that maybe Roosevelt was basically anti-German to begin with. And I didn't know until I was doing the research that Roosevelt had spent a lot of time in Germany as a kid and actually spoke some German, and he hadn't always had the best experiences there. There also was, you know, just his attitude about, we've got to defeat Germany on the battlefield no matter what. That certainly played a role. So it's hard to say why exactly Roosevelt was so dug in.
Yeah, I think we're starting to go down another topic now. Let's finish there. Thanks for joining me, Scott. Scott's book, Agent 110, An American Spymaster and the German Resistance, is now available, and I'll have a link on the website. If you are interested, it's a great read, and I shot through it. Don't forget, you can find me on Facebook. We've had some good discussion recently. Thank you, Ian Miles. I do post things in support of the latest episode, amongst other things. So if you have any comments, thoughts, or would just like to see more, I'm WW2 Podcast on Facebook. I'm not sure what we're looking at next time, as I've been juggling topics about, but I will be back. Until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.